Hello all, and welcome to this quick video on the Weimar Republic between 1918 and 1929. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a kind of quick overview of the period, and then we'll look at certain events in more detail. So the first thing we'll look at is the abdication of the Kaiser in 1918. We'll then look at how that obviously leads to the end of the First World War. Once the war ends, obviously we get the establishment of the Weimar Republic, and also then obviously the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles is signed, then there are problems in Germany. So the first is the Spartacist uprising. We know that once that happens, we get the Putsch. We know that the Weimar also faces the crisis of hyperinflation and also the Munich Putsch, which is obviously Hitler trying to seize power. However, things start to improve. We get the signing of the Dawes Plan in 1924, and that leads to obviously what are considered the golden years. So we'll look at whether they're as golden as we think. However, they all come to an end with the Wall Street crash in 1929, which subsequently obviously leads to the Great Depression. So let's start with the abdication of the Kaiser. So we know by September 1918, Germany is losing the war, but while they're losing the war, people at home don't really accept that and they don't understand why they're losing the war. We know that as a consequence, if the Kaiser abdicates, he runs away, and that 2 days later they sign the armistice. And what was going on in Germany at the time is there's huge hunger. So there's disease in Germany, there's a naval blockade, and it's pretty dire. And ex-soldiers are returning home and they join the protests against the government. So the situation is not great. Now the Weimar is set up in 1919 and it's a very democratic system. So men and women over the age of 20 get the vote. We know that also as a democratic system they have proportional representation, which in theory is very fair but has some problems. We know though that they did also introduce Article 48, which gives the president the power to pass a law in emergency, and that gives him a lot of power that potentially could be a danger later on. We know that also proportional representation leads to very weak governments, so often coalition governments which fail to get things done. Now the Treaty of Versailles was devastating on Germany. So firstly they had to accept the blame in Article 231, and because of that they have to pay for the war effectively. So they have to pay this huge reparation bill of 6.6 billion. We know that they also had their army reduced to 100,000 men, and that's going to create huge unemployment. And they also lose 13% of their foreign colonies. Now that has an impact on their pride as a country, but also their economy because they lose a lot of natural resources and people. Now the Spartacist uprising happens in 1919. Now the government had been established with Ebert as the chancellor, but they're challenged by this group of revolutionaries who are Spartacists. They're communists. And what they want is they want Germany to be run by the working classes. And there's this big protest in Berlin with 100,000. The Spartacists try to lead this group. But Ebert calls in the Freikorps. And the Freikorps, who are the ex-army soldiers, are able to put down the uprising because it's not very well planned. And Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, who lead it, are put to death as a consequence. So they survive this first crisis. But now then there's another crisis, and it's the Putsch. So Ebert had used the Freikorps, but they're quite dangerous. So he tries to disband them in 1920. But they don't react very well to that. So Wolfgang Kapp leads them to try and take over Berlin. So they try and seize Berlin. And the army, because a lot of the Freikorps are ex-army soldiers, don't do anything to stop it. So Ebert's government have to run away. So Ebert's got a major crisis here. So what he does is he asks the workers to go on strike, and they do. And as a consequence, while Wolfgang Kapp has taken charge of Berlin, he can't control industry, and therefore it fails as a consequence. By 1923, we get hyperinflation. So the French invade the Ruhr because the Germans can't pay the second reparations instalment, and that has a catastrophic effect on Germany. So they lose an awful lot of valuable income from that region, which is their industrial heartland. Now the government in their wisdom decide to print off more money, but we know that that creates hyperinflation, so prices get out of control, and that has a hugely negative impact on Germany. So we'll just look a bit about what impacts. So the first is old people's pensions become worthless because the value of money has gone so high. Savings, a lot of the middle class, their savings are gone as a consequence of it. However, the rich are still okay because gold and land don't really lose their value. So they're still fine, but everyone else is really suffering. So the government looks really weak and it looks like the situation is completely out of control. And as a consequence of this, some groups try to seize on it. So the Nazis, for example, are one of those groups. And what the Nazis do in 1923 is they try and take control of the Bavarian government and Munich. So Gustav von Kahr is the leader of the Bavarian government, and he's meeting his allies in a beer hall when the Nazis charge in and they seize control of that beer hall. Eventually they let von Kahr go, which is a mistake because he calls the army and the police. So the day after, when the Nazis try and seize Munich and they try and march on Munich, they're actually met with the army and police, and there's fire shots, and the Nazis supporters and the SA are scattered and they kind of run away. But Hitler is arrested and he's charged with treason, which could have led to death, but actually they're very lenient on Hitler and he only gets 9 months. And actually what it does do is it increases his popularity and his fame within Germany. So we know the situation was out of control, but what happens is Gustav Stresemann comes into office as Chancellor and then Foreign Minister, and he introduces the Rentenmark, which sorts the currency out. He also thinks he needs to try and create some sort of deals with other countries. So he signs the Dawes Plan with America, and that has two major advantages to Germany. The first is it lowers reparations. So every year they have to pay less. It doesn't lower the overall bill, but just every year they pay not quite as much. And they're loaned 800 million marks. So that kickstarts their economy. So between 1924 and 29, we get the golden years, although some would argue it wasn't as golden as we'd think. So there are some advantages and some disadvantages. One of the big advantages is industrial production levels increased to those of 1913. So that's really good. The government give generous pensions and health insurance to people. So people are benefiting from this. Hourly wages are increasing between 1924 and 1929, and exports increase in the country. So they've risen by 40%. So they're selling 40% more, which is great. However, it wasn't all great. So agricultural production never really increases. So farmers are always struggling during the 1920s. So that doesn't improve for them. It's spent more on imports than it does on exports. So while it's exporting 40% more, it's still spending more bringing stuff in. So it's actually running at a deficit. And that's increased by the fact that while it's spending lots on insurance and pensions and things, it's not getting as much tax in as it's spending. So again, a huge deficit. So Germany become hugely reliant on American loans. So if something bad goes wrong with the American loans, then they're in trouble. And they do, in the Wall Street crash in 1929. So the Wall Street crash happens, the stock market collapses, and it leads to an economic depression. And the American banks therefore call in their loans from foreign countries. So the Dawes Plan is called in. So the Germans can't rely on that anymore. And what that leads to is a collapse of the German industry and therefore depression. And that creates conditions for Hitler to seize power, because what it does do is it creates this huge unemployment. So 6 million people by 1929 are unemployed. There's huge poverty. So 300,000 people are homeless in Germany at least. And the Weimar, because of coalition governments, doesn't really deal with this situation very well and doesn't do anything to solve it. So these extreme parties like the communists and Nazis come along with their simple solutions, and people like those solutions and vote for them.